I want to shift our sense that religion is somehow always anti-trans. We don't have to buy that story. It doesn't hold up. It's not true in the present, and it's not true in the past.
Hey fam, it's me, Amara. Welcome to the TransLash podcast, a show where we tell trans stories to save trans lives. Well, this month is the 250th anniversary of the United States, or as many other media outlets are calling it, America 250. And it's caused me to think a lot about what this country means and what it means to be a part of it. I mean, the wild times speak for themselves, where on the one hand, we have mass legalized discrimination against trans people, but on the other hand, have a trans member of Congress, and this year, a trans woman, for the first time ever, won a Tony Award. But actually, this contradiction is why I named TransLash, because it means transgender backlash. That's it all put together. And this contradiction is not new. It's been here since the very beginning of America. That's why we here at TransLash have branded our content during this time Trans250. It's a trans history of America, because the reality is that we've been here since the beginning. And yeah, when we say the beginning, we mean all the way back to colonial times. So today, we're talking to Dr. Scott Larson, who will tell us all about a popular, genderless, religious outlaw from 1776 who called themselves the Publick Universal Friend. But before we get into all of that history, let's start out right now with some trans joy. Cassius Adair is an assistant professor of media studies at the New School in New York City. Cassius mostly studies trans history, but is also a scholar of driver's licenses and the Animorphs, that book series where people turn into animals. But Cassius's current book project is about trans people and computer history. Here's Cassius to tell us more.
Within trans communities, we all knew that trans people built a lot of computers. It seems like the job for trans women, especially in the 20th century, that gives them upward mobility and any kind of class status comes from tech. And then you're like, but wait, I thought big tech were the bad guys. And part of me is like, oh, it's a better story if all this tech was made up by mean white cis men. And then the rest of us in our marginalized identities are fighting the man. But unfortunately, that's not true. That's not how history works. There's a lot of marginalized people who made the stuff that sometimes produced bombs or sometimes produced weird, creepy AI drones or whatever. And so I just want to know more about what that looks like when you have a politics that is often understood in the popular culture as these are the radicals. A lot of times, students come to my class and they're if they have heard of trans people in history, they've often heard of Sylvia Rivera. And I'm word, I really want you to know about those people. But if you are a white 20-year-old living in the East Village, you are not Sylvia Rivera, right? So who are you?
Cassius, you are trans joy. Do you know someone like Cassius who embodies trans joy? Well, send us an email at translash_podcast@translash.org and make sure to include their name, contact information, and why you think they should get a shout out in a future Trans Joy segment. With that, let's go back in time with Dr. Larson. I'm so excited to be speaking today with Dr. Scott Larson. Dr. Larson is a lecturer and director of undergraduate studies at the University of Michigan. He is a scholar of transgender history with a particular focus on early American culture. Scott is currently completing his book manuscript, Transformed: Changing Genders in Early Evangelical Cultures. Today, we're going to be talking about Scott's research on the Publick Universal Friend, who was a genderless religious leader in the 1700s. Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about the Publick Universal Friend.
So before we get into the conversation about the Publick Universal Friend, how did you even come to have an interest in the issue of gender in early America and in the religious fervor that was going on at that time? It doesn't seem like that's a everyday topic of conversation for people.
It is not, unless you meet me at a party and then suddenly you'll be talking about 18th
Well,
century
now anyone who
Methodists.
meets you at a party has been forewarned. They know that they know the conversation that they're in
That
for.
that's right. You get the warning label. So let's see. I can go back a little bit. I had a longstanding interest in queer and trans studies. I studied religion and feminist theory as an undergrad, but also it comes from being a queer and trans kid in a very conservative religious upbringing with my family. And, I went to college and I was really wanting to prove that being gay wasn't a sin. And then later I was like, oh, yeah, I didn't need to prove that through my studies, but I have a lot of sympathy, I think, now that I teach undergraduates for how much people want something that tells them that they're okay. And so I did not expect to be an early American historian, I'm going to be honest. I went to divinity school to study queer and trans theology. And I got forced to take a history class. And so I also tell people sometimes you'll get forced to do something and it will change your life. And I read
Hmm.
a book that talked about women preachers in early America. It's called Strangers and Pilgrims. It's a really fantastic and well researched book on so many figures who I never knew existed. And I came across this person named the Publick Universal Friend, and it blew my mind. This was probably in 2008 or something. I don't know. I guess I've been at this for almost 20 years. And as a trans person in divinity school, it blew my mind that there was somebody who saw religion as a way to have a genderless identity in 1776. So that was it. I was hooked.
I mean, first of all, like your life and interest just prove that, of course, that religion and trans people can coexist at the same time, and that there are trans people who are interested in religion and who are religious themselves. There's this huge capturing right now of the idea of who gets to have religion and who doesn't. And so I think that it's just really important for us to keep that in mind. And of course, the life of the Public Universal Friend shows that. I mean, when I first heard about them, I was like, wait, what, who? Um, but then when you delve into the fact that this person existed and what they sort of created and the life that they led at the same time, at the very moment that American independence was declared, shows that where we've ended up in America right now wasn't always preordained, because there were people that existed at the beginning who existed differently than what we think now. Can you just frame for us who the Public Universal Friend was?
Yeah, so the Public Universal Friend is a unique figure because I give them one birth and two death dates, actually. So the person, Jemima Wilkinson, is born in Rhode Island in 1752, grows up as, and identifies at that time as a young woman, grows up in a Quaker family in Rhode Island. And 1776 claims to have died of what they called the Columbus fever, and to have been resurrected at that point as a genderless spirit. And basically, the claim that they offered was that Jemima Wilkinson had died and that the Spirit of the Lord was inhabiting the tabernacle of flesh left behind by the departing Jemima Wilkinson. The friend writes this really amazing sort of deathbed account of hearing trumpets and hearing this announcement from the Lord, or the Holy Spirit, that this was a sort of like new visitation from God. And from that point forward, Jemima Wilkinson was no more, and the person inhabiting that body was the Public Universal Friend, also used names like Blessed Friend of All Mankind, but was a genderless spirit who then went on to preach pretty broadly to large groups of people in Rhode Island, New York, Pennsylvania, and then ultimately moves with a group of followers to upstate New York. Over 100 people initially. The community grows to over 200 people And at that point, the friend is the leader of this group. There are a range of people, some families, some women who were not married um, or were widowed. It was a unique community because there were women in the community that owned property.
Hmm.
Um, but the friend then leaves time, is what they wrote in the death book of the friend, leaves time in 1819. So I always say that Jemima Wilkinson lived from 1752 to 1776, and the Publick Universal Friend lived from, existed on this plane from 1776 to 1819. So it's a unusual way of having this claim to genderlessness. And for the friend, they are seeing this as part of a biblical claim that comes from the Bible in the book of Galatians that says that after you die, all of the things that are human markers of difference go away. So there's a passage in the Bible that says, in heaven, there is no male nor female, there is no Jew or Greek, there's no longer slaves and masters. And so the friend is saying, I have died. I am after death. I am no longer male nor female. I am a genderless spirit.
I guess one of the things that I'm captivated by is this proclamation of genderlessness, which means that at the time, people were very much aware of what gender was and the
Mhm.
way in which it operated in their lives. Can you just talk a little bit about that in early America? That
Mhm.
why this underscoring of genderlessness, which must mean that they were setting themselves apart from other people in the society that they had been born in.
Yeah, so in some ways, one of the things that's I would say really different, but it's also I don't think as different as we like to imagine it is. But gender was understood as something really connected to how people walked through the world. And so it wasn't as much focused on sort of ideas that like your social role is differently malleable than your body, right? There's not this idea of like, oh, what is your body like when you were born? So
Hmm.
people's gender expectations very much connect with especially things like labor. So one of the ways that a lot of people who were assigned female at birth and lived their lives as men, um, often they worked as farmers or sailors, especially. There's a lot of sailors. Jen Mannion's book, Female Husbands, really explores the lives of these people. But your occupation, how you dressed, how you comported yourself in public, and the relationships you had were understood as sort of like that was how your gender was read. We did not have nearly so robust a conversation about identity or this kind of interior sense of gender identity. People didn't really talk about gender in that way as like something that you deeply felt yourself. Um, it was much more about how you walk through the world.
When you say, but isn't that what gender is now? Like when you say walk through the world, isn't it very much like we have these ideas about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, and a lot of that is the social expectations of those designations. Was it different then, or
So that's what I said, where I don't think it's as different today as we like to think it is. I think
ah,
one of the things
hmm
that's really changed is we now have a much more robust conversation about a kind of interior identity or a felt sense of self. This isn't to say that people in the past didn't ever talk about this, but for example, one of the questions I get a lot about the friend is this kind of um, to say, okay, so the friend felt like they were non-binary or they felt genderless and so they expressed it in this way. And I would say
hmm
like there's not a lot of evidence about how they felt about that, also because in a very different sense had sort of emptied themselves of Jemima Wilkinson and were inhabited by a genderless spirit. Do I know how that relates to like their sense of self? Not outside of a religious context, and that I think is
yeah,
something that's quite
exactly.
different.
Yeah, I think that that's really an important point is that like we're talking about someone who tied their shift in identity not as something that was from their standpoint, not something that was internally driven, right? Or not something that is about the realization of their own identity. I think that that focus on self is something that comes a lot later. For them, it is very much about this kind of extra human experience that leads them to be genderless in their
Hmm.
role, neither male nor female. And in that respect, I mean, what's interesting about that is that that does then track with the way that a lot of ancient pre-American cultures saw people who were trans and non-binary or gender non-conforming as people who were, because of the lack of division, were inspired by or had closer connection to the divine in some way. I mean, that's one of the things that struck me about their story.
Yeah, and this also tracks with a lot of medieval and early modern people who are. I mean, I think Joan of Arc is probably one of the most
That's
famous
right.
examples,
Hmm.
who really framed sort of their gender in religious terms, but also like patriotic and national terms, which is really
Hmm.
different from the Friend because the Friend wants to move away from the world, which is something that is different than maybe the story we have about what early America, especially 1776, means.
I mean, what I find really fascinating about this story, I mean, there's so many things that are fascinating about this story, but it would be hard to see how someone like the Publick Universal Friend could exist in 2026 America, 250 years after their sort of conversion into themselves. And that kind of disrupts the idea that history is linear. I mean, if we had someone who was trans or non binary using our language, claiming that they had become so because of a religious experience, and then had hundreds of people follow them, and then essentially create a new community in the wilderness separate from everyone else. Like that would be almost fanciful, but it's something that happened. I'm sorry, but it's something that happened in early America.
Yeah, and I will say, sometimes you think about like what these people would be like today, right?
Hmm.
And it's like somewhere in social media influencer or the a lot of the people I study because I study religious revivalists of the 18th century, and I think they have a lot in common with the people who are preaching on the street corner or
Hmm.
mounting some megaphone on their car and driving around like I mean, maybe that's not too far from social media either. Um, but I do think um, that um, one of the things about the Friend that is surprising is not just what they did, but how other people responded to this, right? That there was a place for people to imagine this,
Hmm.
to embrace this. And part
That's
of
right.
that comes out of a religious moment where transformation and becoming a new being is really seen as a central mode of what you're trying to do to be saved. And so the Friend is going to religious
Hmm.
revivals in early America. George Whitfield is probably one of the most famous revivalists, and I will say George Whitfield is known as the father of American evangelicism, and he talks in his own memoirs about how he loved to put on girls' clothes and play the part of a woman on stage. He talked about how he learned a secret sin from his fellow men at Oxford, and he talked about how he would routinely fall into such secret sins. So I would
Hmm.
say, like, some of the fathers of American evangelicism have some queer and gender bending pasts, but it was really important for the people who were at the center of these revivals to remake themselves in bodily ways, and so they were trying to find ways to become new people. Also, in the 18th century, this kind of religious practice was seen as effeminate, it was seen as queer, it was seen as disabled and disabling, it was associated with social outcasts, it was associated with people of African descent and indigenous people in the Americas. We often see evangelical history based on what people have shaped that story to be today. But in the 18th century, this was outsiders who were remaking themselves in really radical ways, including the Friend.
Yeah. I mean, well, first of all, please don't tell Paula White or Franklin Graham or any of those people who are, have uh, taken up the mantle of evangelical and Christian nationalism right now that there were the people who actually founded it were gender bending and wearing women's clothes on stage.
Oh yeah.
I think it would cause an aneurysm amongst the both of them. But I think that it's really important, as you say, that the evangelical movement was seen as kind of outside of the strictures of the Anglican Church, or it would have been the Church of England in 1776 in America, like the established churches, the Presbyterian Church, like these established churches in early America. This was seen kind of on the margin. So in that, you then have the space for someone like the Friend. And because it is this space of personal transformation, of people who were outside of the bounds in many ways, that then sets them up to be a person who could be followed because they embodied literally everything that the movement was saying that it was at the time.
Yeah, and the other thing is that this really opens up something that can be really socially destabilizing, right? Because the
Mhm.
claim to to being converted, to being chosen by God, is
Mhm.
based in this individual experience. It is not based on you went to Oxford or Yale and became a preacher. It's based on this conversion. And this is really unsettling to the people with the power over the institutionalized modes of religion.
Mhm.
Because, you know, a person who is enslaved can be saved and can be a preacher and can have all kinds of transformations, um, including transformation from being enslaved to being free. And
Mhm.
that is something that people who are seeing this kind of radical religious experience can claim, in spite of whatever worldly orders are saying, this is what the law is, this is who can preach, this is who's licensed.
What did the people following the Friend think of the Friend? Like, how much of their genderlessness was the appeal and following them? And I continue to think about this as being really radical because even if we use the idea of them as sort of a social media influencer, what's different is that a social media influencer is trying to ultimately get you to do something remotely, or it's still virtual in a way.
Yeah.
What's wild about this is that not only did people know about the Friend and believe in them, but something about them was so compelling that they were willing to uproot their lives and their families and move again to the wilderness to create an entire community with them. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, and I think that like any community, there's a range of things. So some people really they uproot their families or they end up leaving their families to follow the Friend. Like they are so compelled. There are also people,
Well,
especially some women, who are happy to leave the families and situations that they have, and they are now moving to a
hmm,
community where they are part of a group of women following a genderless spirit. They have power and decision making capacity in their communities. There's the other thing that is driving some of the people is land speculation. And this is how the Friend and a lot of religious communities are also
huh,
part of settler colonial histories. And
hmm,
so one of the things that's happening is people are speculating in purchasing lands that are either like being negotiated for with the Haudenosaunee people who are in upstate New York, and the Friend actually ends up being part of some treaty negotiations and conversations, um, really telling everybody to repent and be saved, not necessarily. themselves really like trying to get land, but some of the people who join the community are absolutely doing so to try to invest in or gain property. Like many communities, this also becomes, contentious. People fight, people break up, people fight about money, they fight about land. And so there's a whole range of motivations. And some of the people are really devoutly invested and connected with the friend, and other people are also engaged in some other reasons, and those can change over time, right? You can start by being a real believer, and the term they used at the time was apostate. So you might be really a believer and then be like, no, I don't think so. And some of those people wrote really scathing and really nasty and kind of like satirical or pornographic accounts of the friend and published them in newspapers at the time.
Wow, that means that they were seen as a threat at the time, right? If people had to go to those lengths to try to paint them as the other, that also means that who they were was large enough to be perceived as a threat.
Absolutely. A threat and also an object of news. One of the things that
Mm.
surprises me about researching trans history is that trans people are endlessly being discovered. Like what what happens is like very famously in 1950, Christine Jorgensen makes like the cover of newspaper magazines, and they're like, "This is the first ever. It's the first ever since," and they'll talk about Lily Elbe, right? And they're like, "Oh, that was the first ever," and then they will go back and back and back. Like there's articles in the early 1900s saying like these women, they're talking about trans men, denied their sex for years. This is a new phenomenon, and then they'll cite Joan of Arc, right? So one of the things that is really remarkable in this account is that people would write about the Publick Universal Friend and go to kind of they were I mean, the friend put on a show. The friend had like carriages and outfits, and people came to see it, and they would write about it in the newspaper. And they would say things like, this has never happened before except these other people, right? And so one of the things that's always amazing to me about being a researcher of trans history is how trans people always knew and never knew.
um, how did we know about the Public Universal Friend? And why aren't they more prominent in history?
Yeah, so the Public Universal Friend, like many gender nonconforming and trans figures, kind of gets discovered and then forgotten, then discovered and forgotten. I read about the friend in some feminist histories that really kind of said that the friend was a woman who denied her femininity, kind of a traitor to womanhood, and also claimed to be a man in order to get ahead. I will say, as a trans man, that sounds like a familiar story, and I had some suspicions about that read.
Yes, very familiar.
Um, and at the same time, the friend is kind of a famous local figure of New York and would be sort of written about, in local publications every few years. It's been really
Mm.
exciting to see people learn more about the friend. I kind of stumbled across this, and it changed my life.
What do you think the friend who had their conversion in
Mhm.
1776 tells us about transness in America
Yeah, so
that's instructive for us in 2026?
yeah. So one thing it's always exciting to find figures who, you know, engage in a range of gender variance and gender practices. And so the friend is great in that sense, but also the friend really shows how some forms of gender variation or gender crossing or genderlessness happen within religious communities by very devout people. And in fact, religious practice can be the way that happens
Hmm.
for some people, right?
Wow.
So I want
Mm.
to shift our sense that religion is somehow always anti-trans. We don't have to buy that story. It doesn't hold up. It's not true in the present, and it's not true in the past. But the second thing I want to say is not just about the friend or about sort of like belief itself, but also that the friend was part of a community. The friend founded a community, and
That's right.
trans people and genderqueer and gender nonconforming people have always been part of the world. We can often look for single figures who we like see as heroes, and that's great. But those people were parts of worlds. They had people who loved them. They had people who hated them. That's what it means to be part of a community and a world. But people have wanted to be around and to live with
Mhm.
and to love with and to fight with and work with trans and queer and non-binary people as long as they've been in the world. So I think the thing is like both what this teaches about the friend, about religion, but also about that like queer and trans and non-binary people belong with other people and have been loved for a long time.
Scott, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us and shedding light on this historical figure who has been discovered and erased countless times, and hopefully not to be erased again through your efforts and through that of others. This is such important work, and just thank you for coming on to talk about them for Trans250. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a joy to share.
Thank you. That was historian Dr. Scott Larson. Thank you for joining me on the TransLash podcast. If you like what you saw today, then hit the like button, make sure that you subscribe, and then also hit the notification bell so that you never miss an episode. So before we go today, I just wanted to let you know what stands out for me as my favorite moment of the episode. I mean, the whole thing, right? The fact that the Publick Universal Friend is someone that we just don't hear about in any of our history books is wild, because there's so many other random people that we hear about, like Davy Crockett or others that are not necessarily like essential to American history or tell us anything about early American history in this way, but that this person is someone that we just never heard of. Is wild. But specifically when Dr. Larson spoke about the fact that evangelical religion was something that was deemed to be radical at the time, and how it was this conglomeration of people who wanted to express gender differently, as well as being informed by Native culture and African American culture, is just wild. Also something that we don't know about, and it's so far divorced from the way that things are actually unfolding right now, and the way that this religion, which was born out of this radical movement as it was framed, is actually now being used in a very conservative, very retro, very authoritarian, dangerous way, is wild to me. But the whole thing, this entire story, it should just be like in the beginning of every history book. So what was your favorite moment from this episode? Make sure that you respond in the comments, and we'll be sure to respond to you. We want to hear what you thought. Okay, that's all we have time for today. See you soon.